My sense is, and I'm not sure of what I'm about to say, my sense is that we may be at a pivotal turning point for the history of our young species. Maybe. We're the youngest species in the evolutionary neighborhood. Human beings have only been here, anatomically modern humans, for about 175,000 years. We're the youngsters. But I suspect that we may be seeing the potential extinction of our species sometime in the next century. It's difficult to say this. There has been so many prophetic, apocalyptic visions over history, and they've all turned out to be wrong, thank gosh. But I'm going to share a little statistic with you, and you make the judgment call. I teach at the Wharton School. It's the oldest business school in the world, and what I like to tell our CEOs and business leaders in our advanced management program is they got to go back to basics and understand what the real economy is. The real economy is photosynthesis. The sun's energy bathes the earth. We pick up photosynthesis in our plants, and all the rest of economic activity for our fellow creatures and our species is all dependent on that bottom line. So here's where we are tonight. We human beings, 6.8 billion of us, we are less than 1% of the entire biomass of the earth, less than 1%. We're now using 24% of all the photosynthesis on earth. It takes my breath away. We have become monsters. And we're going from 6 to 9 billion human beings in the next 30 years. This just isn't sustainable. Either we have to go or we have to change. We've had two seminal events in the last 18 months, which I believe represent the end game for the great industrial era that spanned 2 centuries, propelled by fossil fuels. Let me take you back to July 2008. You remember in July 2008, the price of oil went up to $147 on world markets. Prices went through the roof. Inflation soared. Basic items, including groceries at the food store, petrol for your car, became prohibitively expensive. There were food riots in 30 countries. And the reason is everything depends on the carbon deposits of the Jurassic Age. We built an entire civilization on those carbon deposits. Our food is grown in petrochemical fertilizers and pesticides. Virtually all of the construction materials of this civilization are based on, embedded in fossil fuels. Virtually all of our pharmaceutical products are still fossil fuel based. Most of our clothes are based on those carbon deposits. Our transportation, our power, our heat, our light, our logistics, our supply chain, it's all made out of the carbon deposits of a previous period in history. So when oil hit $147 a barrel, inflation soared, purchasing power plummeted, and the entire economic engine of the Industrial Revolution shut off in July of 2008. That was the meltdown. That was the earthquake. The collapse of the financial market 60 days later, that was the aftershock. Our world leaders haven't figured that out yet. We hit what I call peak globalization at $147 a barrel. We now know the outer limits of how far we can globalize in an industrial age based on fossil fuels. And the reason we hit peak globalization at $147 a barrel is something called peak oil per capita. Not to be confused with peak oil production. They're two different things. Peak oil production is controversial, but peak oil per capita is not. That occurred in 1979, over 30 years ago. And that is, if you distributed all the oil reserves that we knew we had in 1979 to everyone living on the planet at that time, that's the most each person could enjoy if it was equitably shared. We found more oil since then, but population rose quicker. So if we distributed all the oil reserves we know we have today in the world to 6.8 billion human beings, there's simply less per person. So I think you see where I'm headed. When China and India made a bid to bring 1/3 of the human race into the industrial revolution based on fossil fuels, the demand pressure against the supply was just too great. And as their economies heated up, 8, 9, 10% growth, we couldn't hold the line. And when prices hit $147 a barrel, the engine turned off. Now, what I'm suggesting is this. We can't get through that wall. Right now, the economy is starting to grow around the world, even though it's anemic, because we're replenishing inventories. But what's happening? Oil is going over $80 a barrel again. So I've said to my colleagues, you tell me how we get through that wall of $147. As pressure builds, inflation will go up. We'll keep shutting off that engine. This is an end game. We are there. My feeling is when we look back at this period of history, we will see July of 2008 as an end game. Fast forward, December 2009, Copenhagen. World leaders from 192 countries come together to address the entropy bill from the industrial age, the spent CO2 from 2 centuries of using fossil fuels. Our scientists in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change at the UN tell us that we may go up 3 degrees Celsius, maybe more in this century. That doesn't sound too bad until you stop to consider that if we only go up 3 degrees, it takes us back to the temperature on Earth 3 million years ago in the Pliocene. If we go 2 to 3 degrees, and this is looking very optimistic that we would stay that low, we risk the extinction of upwards of 70% of all the species of assessed life on this Earth, perhaps by the time your grandchildren are my age. This is a wipeout. We've only had 5 waves of biological extinction on Earth in the last 450 million years. Every time we had a mass extinction, it took 10 million years to recover the biodiversity we lost. As my wife says, we're not grasping the enormity of this moment. The frame of this seems too big to comprehend, so we're either in denial or business as usual. But despite the fact that our scientists say this could be the greatest threat we've ever faced, the entropy bill, catastrophic climate change, our world leaders were not able to cut a deal at Copenhagen. It broke up in complete acrimony. It collapsed. So here's my question for tonight. Why were our business leaders unable, even the day before the shutdown at 147 a barrel, to know it was coming? And how come they're unable to address it after the fact? And why is it our government leaders were unable to close a deal on climate change, even though it's probably the greatest threat we've ever faced since we've been on this planet as a species? I believe that the problem lies deeper than just the inability to come up with a new global mechanism to regulate a global economy. And I think it runs deeper than just the inability of world leaders to come to a binding treaty agreement on carbon emissions. My sense is the problem lies with the fact that our business leaders, our government leaders, and for that matter, the rest of us, we are continuing to rely on 18th and 19th century ideas about human nature and the human journey that were spawned at the beginning of the market era, the nation-state era. And at that period of time, we had a great discussion, the Enlightenment. And in this august chamber, this is the British Royal Society for the Arts. Much of that discussion was centered in this society. For 1,500 years, the church had the last say about human nature. And the church was very clear. The little baby is born in sin, depraved. And if we want salvation, we have to wait for Christ in the next world to come. End of story. The Enlightenment philosophers took on that worldview. They challenged that shibboleth, and they came up with a different equation for what human nature is all about. And of course, there was a debate even then, but let me go into some of the key architects. John Locke, the great political philosopher of the Enlightenment, he said, look, babies are born tabula rasa, blank slate. They're not born in sin. But he did leave a little opening. He said, however, there is a predisposition to acquire property. Somebody should have caught him on that. Adam Smith, the great Scottish economist of the Enlightenment, said that our little babies do have an inclination for moral sentiment. He wrote a great book on moral sentiments and sympathy. But he said our key nature is we're born with a drive to be autonomous and to pursue our material self-interest in the market, the very basis of classical economic theory. Later in the 19th century, Jeremy Bentham said, little babies are actually born with a desire to have pleasure and to avoid pain, and we are driven by utilitarian desires. Later in the century, Charles Darwin said, every organism, their drive is to secure their survival by reproducing themselves. And finally, the capstone of that century, Sigmund Freud, at the end of that 19th century, said, actually, little babies are born with an insatiable sexual appetite and want to extinguish their libido. May I ask how many parents here, how many of you have had children? Parents, please raise your hands. Well, what do you think? Is that what it's all about, our little babies? When that little baby came out and mom and dad looked in their eyes, is that what we were seeing? Evil, depraved, rational, calculating, detached, autonomous, self-interested, driven by materialism, utilitarian to the core, and seeking to extinguish their libido. If that truly is our human nature, I suspect we're doomed. I just don't see any way that 6.8 billion human beings are going to come together and create an interdependent, interconnected, sustainable and just global economy and address the issue of healing the biosphere if that's our human nature. Do you? Does anyone think our self-interest will come together to make this all happen? One person, defender of the faith. In the last 10 years, under the radar, there's been some very interesting developments in evolutionary biology, neurocognitive science, child development research, and many other fields, which is beginning to challenge some of these long-held shibboleths that we've had about human nature and the meaning of the human journey. And I should say, in all fairness, even during the Enlightenment, there were other voices to be heard. In Hume to Schopenhauer. There wasn't all the way I'm describing it. But this was the dominant frame of reference, utilitarian, self-interested, materialistic. But there is another frame of reference emerging in the sciences, which is quite interesting. It really challenges these assumptions. And with that, the institutions that we have created based on those assumptions, our educational institutions, our business practices, our governing institutions, etc. Let me take you back to the early 1990s. Sleepy little laboratory in Parma, Italy, and scientists had a MRI brain scanning machine on a macaque monkey as the macaque monkey was trying to open up a nut. They wanted to see how the neurons would light up. So the monkey's trying to open up the nut, the neurons light up. And just by serendipity, and this is how science sometimes happens, a human being walked into the laboratory, I don't know if it was by mistake, and he was hungry, he saw the nuts and opened up one of the nuts and tried to crack it open. The macaque monkey was totally shocked because who was this invader in his laboratory? And he didn't move. He just gazed at this human trying to open up the nut, just like he had done a few seconds earlier. And then the scientist looked on the MRI brain scanner. The same exact neurons were lighting up when he observed the human being opening the nut as when the monkey opened the nut. And the scientists had not a clue as to what this was. They thought the MRI machine had broken. They then began to put MRI brain scanning machines on other primates, especially chimpanzees with our big neocortex. Then they went to humans. And what they found over and over again is something called mirror neurons. And that is that we are apparently soft-wired, some of the primates, all humans. We suspect elephants. We're not sure about dolphins and dogs. We've just begun. But all humans are soft-wired with mirror neurons so that if I'm observing you, your anger, your frustration, your sense of rejection, your joy, whatever it is, and I can feel what you're doing, the same neurons will light up in me as if I'm having that experience myself. Now, this isn't all that unusual. We know if a spider goes up someone's arm and I'm observing it going up your arm, I'm going to get a creepy feeling. Or if you puncture yourself and blood comes out, I'm going to feel like that. We take this for granted, but we are actually soft-wired to actually experience another's plight as if we are experiencing ourselves. But mirror neurons are just the beginning of a whole range of research going on in neuropsychology and brain research and in child development that suggest that we are actually soft-wired not for aggression and violence and self-interest and utilitarianism, that we are actually soft-wired for sociability, attachment, as John Bowlby might have said, attachment, affection, companionship, and that the first drive is the drive to actually belong. It's an empathic drive. What is empathy? It's very complicated. It isn't I just feel your pain to caricature President Clinton's discussion about it. When little babies are in a nursery and one baby cries, the other babies will cry in response. They just don't know why. That's empathic distress. It's built into their biology. Around 2.5 years of age, a child actually can begin to recognize himself in a mirror. That's when you begin to mature empathy as a cultural phenomenon. And that is once a toddler can identify themselves, then they know that if they're observing someone else have a feeling, they know that if they feel something, it's because they're feeling it because someone else has it. Do you follow me? They're two separate beings. Selfhood goes together with empathic development. Increasing selfhood, increasing empathic development. Around 8 years of age, a child learns about birth and death. They learn where they came from, that they have a one and only life, that life is fragile and vulnerable, and one day they're going to die. That's the beginning of an existential trip. Because when a child learns about birth and death and they have a one and only life, they realize how fragile and vulnerable life is. It's very tough being alive on this planet, whether you're a human being or a fox navigating the forest. So when a child learns that life is vulnerable and fragile and that every moment is precious and that they have their own unique history, it allows the child then to experience another's plight in the same way. That other person or other being, could be another creature, has a one and only life. It's tough to be alive. They're struggling to flourish and be. And the odds are not always good. So if you think about the times that we've empathized with each other, our fellow creatures, it's always because we felt their struggle. We have the width of death in empathy and the celebration of life. We feel their struggle to be and to flourish, and we show solidarity with our compassion. Empathy is the opposite of utopia. Exact opposite. There is no empathy in heaven. I guarantee you, I'll tell you before you get there. There isn't any empathy in heaven because there's no mortality. There's no empathy in utopia because there is no suffering. Empathy is grounded in the acknowledgement of death and the celebration of life and rooting for each other to flourish and be. It's based on our frailties and our imperfections. So when we talk about building an empathic civilization, we're not talking about utopia. We're talking about the ability of human beings to show solidarity, not only with each other, but our fellow creatures who have a one and only life on this little planet. It has very different political implications than utopian visions or theological visions. We are Homo empathicus. So here's the question. We know that consciousness changes in history. The way our brain is wired today is not the way a medieval serf's brain would be wired, and their brain wouldn't be the same as the wiring of a forager hunter 30,000 years ago. So the question I asked at the beginning of this study 6 years ago with this book is, how does consciousness change in history? Because I wanted to imagine the following proposition. Is it possible that we human beings who are soft-wired for empathic distress, is it possible we could actually extend our empathy to the entire human race as an extended family, and to our fellow creatures as part of our evolutionary family, and to the biosphere as our common community? If it's possible to imagine that, then we may be able to save our species and save our planet. And what I say to you tonight, if it's impossible to even imagine that, I don't see how we're going to make it. So I asked myself the question, how does consciousness change over history, and does empathy develop? And if so, how? When we look back at history, the historians were not of much help to me, because the historians, by and large, chronicle pathology, the terrible moments, the Holocaust, the genocides, the blowbacks, the colonization, the wars, the exploitation, the redress of grievances. Why? They're newsworthy. But then the question is, why are those events newsworthy? Because they trigger flight and fright in us, because they're not what we ordinarily know every day. So they become newsworthy in their pathology. But then when you chronicle all of history with the pathological moments, we get a pretty dim vision of the human race. So I did get some help from historians, social historians, but I had to go back and look at narrative. And through narrative, we can get a sense of how consciousness changes in history. Beginning with Gilgamesh, all the way to the Greek tragedies, the chivalric romances, the novel, to cinema and the internet, there is an alternative history here. George Frederick Hegel said happiness are the blank pages of history, because they're the periods of harmony. Historians don't write about them. But if we were pathological the way the historian said, we would have perished a long time ago. We'd be so monstrous. There is another history. It's made up of 100 acts of kindness every day. So when I went back in history, I asked, what's the process in which consciousness changes and empathy develops? I believe that it happens when we change our energy regimes. When we create more complex energy regimes that allow us to bring more diverse people together in more complex civilizations, it changes consciousness. But when we do that, it requires a second thing, a communication revolution to manage these new energy regimes. When energy regimes converge with communication revolutions, when they come together to create more complex civilizations, it fundamentally changes consciousness. It changes temporal spatial orientation. I'll give you an example of convergence in history. Go back and you remember the Sumerians in Mesopotamia when you studied cultural anthropology. We studied them because they were the first to create civilization. These great hydraulic irrigation systems that they set up to capture photosynthesis in cereal crops. Now remember, before the Sumerians and before hydraulic agriculture, people lived in little garden-fed agricultural villages with small pastoralism. When they went to these great irrigation systems, they had to indenture thousands of men for the first time and take them out of their tribal villages and get them to build these massive canals. Then they had to create craft skills to establish the dike systems. They had to set up the royal granaries, the royal roads, the distribution systems, and urban life in order to manage this complex new energy system based on irrigation, and that is capturing photosynthesis in barley and wheat, stored energy. It was so complicated, it required a communication revolution to manage the whole thing. And the Sumerians created cuneiform and writing. And what is so interesting is wherever these great hydraulic irrigation civilizations were created, the Middle East, India, China, and Mexico, independently, humans figure out some form of writing to manage it. That's amazing. Let's skip up to the industrial age. 19th century, another convergence of communication energy. The print press had been around since Gutenberg, and even before, the Chinese and Koreans had to form the print press. But in the 19th century, we introduced steam technology into print production. Linotype and rotary steam technology allowed us to increase the speed of print production and the efficiency and lower the cost. At the same time, between 1830 and 1880, we introduced public schools in Europe and America and mass literacy. And we created a print literate mind to manage and organize coal and steam, the first industrial revolution. We could never have organized a complex coal steam revolution with codex. Too slow. 20th century, another convergence of communication energy. The telegraph was transitional, but the telephone, and then later cinema, radio, television, etc., electricity communication, converged with the internal combustion engine, oil, and the suburban age to create a second industrial revolution. These convergences of communication energy are very interesting because the communication revolution not only organizes the energy, it changes the mind. It changes consciousness, fundamentally. Let's go back. Every forage or hunter society in history, they foraged, they hunt. That was their energy. They communicated with oral language to organize foraging and hunting in early culture. Every single one of them, without exception, created mythological consciousness. Every single one of them. If we go to the great hydraulic agricultural civilizations in the Middle East, India, China, every single one of them gave rise to theological consciousness. The great Abrahamic religions in the Middle East, Buddhism and a secular religion of Confucianism and others in the East, all came during that period of time. Theological consciousness. If you go to the first industrial revolution, when print communication organized coal and steam power, we saw the emergence of ideological consciousness. It developed during the Enlightenment, the very struggle between sense and sensibility. In the 20th century, when we went to electricity communication, we moved from ideological consciousness to psychological consciousness. Many of the early experimenters in electricity were also experimenting in psychology and consciousness. The two dovetailed with each other. My grandparents couldn't think psychologically. They could think ideologically and theologically and even mythologically. But I'll give you an example. If we were at a family dinner and my grandma I could see she was at the table and not feeling comfortable, and then when no one's looking, she throws a plate on the floor. And I said, Grandma, I saw that. That appears to be a passive-aggressive act. Something's bothering you. You must have had family gatherings when you were young. Something tipped this off in your childhood experience. So if we can chat about it and talk it out, we can get to this. Grandma does not have a clue. You with me? She can't think therapeutically. So these changes of reference do count for mythological consciousness, theological, ideological, psychological. In the Empathic Civilization, I argued that our young people in the millennial generation are moving to what we call dramaturgical consciousness. Too much to go into tonight. But when we bring new energy and communication revolutions together, we shift consciousness. Empathy extends to new domains. The real invisible hand is empathy. Because more complex civilizations, bringing more diverse people together, require more individuation and differentiation to create skills. And when we individualize and differentiate to create all these different skills, they all have to cohere in some kind of new social fabric that's integrated, the civilization. Empathy is the invisible hand. Empathy is what allows us to stretch our sensibility with another so that we can cohere in larger social units. To empathize is to civilize. To civilize is to empathize. Let me be very concrete. With forage or hunter societies, communication only extended to the local tribe and shouting distance. Everyone over in the next mountain was the alien other. So empathy only extended to blood ties. When we went to the great hydraulic agricultural civilization, script allowed us to extend the central nervous system and to annihilate more time and space and bring more people together. And the differentiation of skills and the increasing selfhood not only led to theological consciousness, but empathy now extended to a new fiction. And that is, instead of just associating with one's blood ties, we detribalized and began associations based on religious ties. So a new fiction, Jews start to see all other Jews as extended family and empathize with Jews. Christians start to see all other Christians as extended family and empathize with Christians. Muslims, the same. When we get to the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution, and we extend markets now to larger areas and create a fiction called the nation state. And all of a sudden, the Brits start to see others in Britain as extended family. The Germans start to see Germans as extended family. The Americans as Americans. There was no such thing as Germany. There was no such thing as France. These are fictions. But they allow us to extend our family so that we can have loyalties and identities based on the new complex energy communication revolutions we have that annihilate time and space. Does this make some sense? So here's the question. And this doesn't happen in some kind of a beautifully linear way. There are blowbacks, and there are bad times, and there are dark days, etc. And many times the blowbacks happen at the end of one civilization, the beginning of the other, when new identities put in doubt the old identities, and the xenophobism kicks back with a vengeance. There is no fail-safe that you can go from one civilization to another. There are long periods where that doesn't happen. But if we have gone from empathy in blood ties, to empathy in religious associational ties, to empathy based on national identification, is it really a big stretch to imagine the new technologies allowing us to connect our empathy to the human race writ large in a single biosphere? On what reason would we stop here at the nation-state identity and only have ideological empathy or theological-based empathy or tribal-based blood tie empathy? There is a deep paradox to history, a conundrum, I would say, that we really haven't talked about. And that is, as more complex civilizations bring more diverse people together and new communication systems allow us to stretch our central nervous system, and the invisible hand of empathy allows us to cohere in broader social ways, those civilizations also use up more energy and create more entropy. As we create increasingly more complex energy-consuming civilizations, they certainly create a more cosmopolitan attitude. They certainly bring more people together, stretch consciousness, stretch empathy, but at the expense of entropy. It's really an empathy-entropy paradox. Today, and in the book, I talk about civilizations where there are great empathy surges followed by great entropy collapses. Rome comes to my mind immediately. First century urban Christianity in Rome was a great empathic surge because this great civilization allowed people from all over the world, and the known world at that time, to come together, loosen their blood ties, and then began to have to reassociate based on individuality in Rome. And that existential sense allowed this new association called Christian brotherhood to come together, Christian sisterhood. But that same civilization that created the possibilities also denuded the soil base of the Mediterranean, because 2/3 of the revenue of Rome by the 3rd century was based on agriculture, no longer conquest. By the 4th century, they denuded that soil base. The Entropy Bill was in, and they could not maintain this massive empire any longer. And well before the hordes were at the gates, Rome had collapsed. And remember, there were 1.5 million people in Rome in the 4th century. There were 70,000 people living in rubble in the 7th century. And we saw a dark period of 4 or 5 centuries before the early medieval era could move us again forward. Today, we're in a globally connected world. Our youngsters can begin to empathize across all the traditional lines. In the last 50 years, imagine how empathy is extended. Women, half the human race, finally recognized. When my mother was a little kid, the women didn't have the vote in the United States of America. And then we extended empathy to the disabled, and to those of different sexual preferences, and to the people of color, and to minorities. And now to our fellow creatures we're beginning to recognize as having rights and recognition in law. This has all happened very quickly in terms of the long history of empathy. But now my sense is we almost can grasp the possibility of global empathy. I mean, with all the problems and blowbacks, etc. But I think we also can grasp that we may be at the moment of extinction. It is a bittersweet irony. We may be right at the point of being able to get this together and think empathically as a species, and we may be right at that point where we can sense our own potential extinction. The empathy-entropy paradox. How do we break it? We are on the cusp of a new energy communication convergence that I believe may give us a chance to stretch our empathy to biosphere consciousness. I don't know if we'll get there in time. I really don't know if we'll get there in time. You younger people will figure out if we got there in time. We had a very impressive communication revolution in the last 10 years. The personal computer and the internet. That is, and satellite, wireless, and Wi-Fi connection. This second generation communication is very different than first generation electricity communication. That was top down. Telegraph, telephone, cinema, radio, television, centralized. The new communications, the ICT revolution, is open source, flat, peer-to-peer, and here's the key word. It's distributed. Meaning 2 billion people can put a little utensil in their hand, and they can send their own video, audio, and text to all the other 2 billion people at the same time, at the speed of light, with more power than the centralized BBC, and we did it all in 15 years. What I want to suggest to you is that this distributed ICT revolution, communication revolution, is just now converging with a new energy regime, distributed energy. When distributed communication manages distributed energy, we have the possibility of distributing consciousness to the biosphere. What are distributed energies? Well, let's compare them to elite energies. Elite energies are energies that aren't in the backyard when you go home tonight. Chances are, go home, take a flashlight in the backyard. I will be willing to bet you won't find any coal, oil, gas, or uranium in the backyard. They're elite because they're only found in certain places. They require huge military investments to secure them, huge geopolitical investments to manage them, massive capital flows to organize them. Fossil fuels, the first and second industrial revolution, are the most elite centralized energy infrastructures we've ever created. Those energies are sunsetting. The infrastructure based on them has been on life support since July 2008. It is not coming back. What are distributed energies? Go home tonight. You have all the energy you need in the backyard. The wind blows across this world every day. The sun shines on this planet every day. We all have heat under the ground, that hot geothermal core ready to be used. We have garbage. It can be recycled energy. Wherever there's water, you have small hydroelectricity. We have agricultural and forestry waste in the rural areas and the ocean tides coming in and out every day. These are distributed energies. I've been privileged to advise the EU for the last decade, and we've been privileged to develop a third industrial revolution economic game plan, which has been endorsed, some of you may know, by the European Parliament and the Commission. We're rolling this out in member states. And let me roll this out for you here. It's not yet in the UK, but in the continental Europe. Pillar 1, all of the EU, including the UK, have agreed to go to 20% renewable energy by 2020. That's a third of the electricity of Europe. Done deal. Pillar 2, we asked ourselves the question in Brussels, how do we collect all this renewable energy? The first idea is, let's go where the sun is, the Mediterranean, harness the sun and ship it across Europe. Or let's find the wind off Ireland, harness the wind, centralize it, ship it back. I do not oppose centralized solar and wind, but that's not 21st century thinking. They were using, originally we were talking about centralized because fossil fuels are centralized, and we always went to the source, collected it, and then shipped it out. But if renewable energies are distributed and found in virtually every square foot of this world, why would we only collect them in a few central points? So pillar 2, we think buildings. Pillar 2 of this infrastructure, buildings. The number one cause of climate change is buildings. It uses a third of the energy, a third of the CO2. Parenthetically, the number 2 cause of climate change is beef production and consumption and related animal husbandry. Number 3 is worldwide transport. The reason I stop here is not one leader in 192 countries has made a single statement about the number 2 cause of climate change, which shows us we're not really serious. Not one world leader. But let's take buildings. The vision in the third industrial revolution rollout is every single existing building in Europe, every home, office, factory, shopping center, every rural and urban building that exists right now converted to a partial power plant. So it can collect the distributed energy around the building, the sun, the wind, the heat under the ground, etc. The new buildings, positive power from the beginning. We have buildings up now in Spain with Acciona in Navarro, Spain. We have now a building going up with Bouygues in Paris. They actually produce more power than they need, just from the local energy around them. Payback 4 to 5 years. So we imagine a construction boom across Europe. If you want to jumpstart an economy, it's always about construction. When construction stops, the economy goes down. So pillar 2, reconvert every building across Europe from the Irish Sea to the doorsteps of Russia. Pillar 3, we had the concern early on, how do we store renewable energy? Because the sun isn't always shining in the United Kingdom. The wind isn't always blowing off Ireland. So we committed an €8 billion rollout of hydrogen storage technology to store these energies. We also, like other storage, batteries, flywheels, capacitors, water pumping, whatever works. So let's say the sun's hitting your roof, you generate a little electricity. If you have some surplus, electrolyze water. High school chemistry. You slept through that class. You don't have a clue. We had the anode, the cathode, we slipped it in the water, and the hydrogen comes out, and you put it in a tank. And then when you need the electricity, because the sun isn't shining, convert it back to electricity. Yes, there's an energy loss. Do we have any engineers here? You'll explain to people afterwards, it's the second law of thermodynamics. Whenever you convert energy, you lose energy. Entropy is the unavailable energy. You never break even, you always lose. And if we understood the amount of conversion loss in bringing uranium to the nuclear power plant or coal to your house, it's through the roof compared to what I've just talked about. So pillar 1, renewable energy distributed. Pillar 2, our buildings become our own personal power plants. Pillar 3, we use hydrogen and other storage technologies. And pillar 4 is where the distributed communication converges with distributed energy to create a third industrial revolution. We use the same exact technology that created the internet. It's actually identical. We take the power grid of the EU and transform it to an intergrid that acts like the internet. So that when millions and millions and millions of buildings are producing just a little bit of their own energy, they can store some of it in hydrogen like you store digital in media. Then what we don't need at any given time of day, share it across an intergrid across all of Europe, like we share information on the internet. Same technologies. This is a third industrial revolution. It's power to the people. It's either, you can either frame it as distributed capitalism or cooperative socialism. It's a hybrid. It's a lateral shift in capitalism because it requires everyone to be an entrepreneur. But it also requires a new social model because we have to set up energy cooperatives so people share their energy across continents. It's a 21st century market social model. And it answers a question we couldn't answer for a long time. And that is, how do we run the world on solar roofs and windmills, for God's sakes? Governments would say to me, Mr. Rifkin, come on, don't be so naive. Those are soft energies. They have some place, but we need coal, oil, gas, and uranium. Those are hard energies for a global economy. Actually, we couldn't answer this question for 30 years. We now can, because of second-generation grid IT. The cutting edge of IT, 7 years we've had it. We can now connect with software hundreds of thousands or even millions of desktop computers. We can connect them. When we connect them, the distributed power exceeds by a magnitude whatever you can get with centralized supercomputers. We can take grid IT to the transmission lines. When millions of buildings are producing just a little bit of their own energy, storing it with hydrogen like you store digital and media, and then what they don't need, sharing it across Europe with distributed IT, the actual power exceeds anything you could imagine with centralized nuclear and coal-fired power plants. And everyone under the age of 30 that grew up on file sharing knows exactly what I'm talking about. We called it cheating, file sharing. I see the guilty. Look, the music companies did not see the power of distributed music, and the music companies collapsed within 6 years. The newspapers did not see the blogospheres coming, and the newspapers are now in trouble. Microsoft did not see Linux coming. Distributed power won't work on the Commons, not a chance. Encyclopedia Britannica didn't see Wikipedia coming. We're now talking about distributed power. For a generation that grew up with the idea of producing your own information and sharing it, why shouldn't the next generation grow up with the idea of generating their own energy and be responsible for sharing it across continents? This gives us distributed consciousness, maybe biosphere consciousness, because when all of us take responsibility for that small swath of the biosphere where we're husbanding the photosynthesis, and then we share it with our neighbors across continents, we become aware of our responsibility to the biosphere. The last few minutes, let me say, this is not academic. Go into any London schoolhouse tomorrow. Our children are being revolutionized in terms of their consciousness to fit the new temporal spatial orientation of the biosphere. The kids in first grade are learning that everything they do, the clothes they wear, the food they eat, the electricity they use, the car the family drives, all of that affects their carbon footprint and impacts some other human being or some other creature somewhere else in the biosphere, because we're all connected. That's a revolution. We have the technology that allows us to extend the central nervous system and to think viscerally as a family, not just intellectually. When that earthquake hit Haiti, and then Chile, but especially Haiti, within an hour the Twitters came out, and within 2 hours some cell phone videos, YouTube, and within 3 hours the entire human race was in an empathic embrace coming to the aid of Haiti. If we were, as the Enlightenment philosophers suggested, in materialistic, self-interested, utilitarian, pleasure-seeking, and libido-driven, it couldn't account for the response to Haiti. It was visceral. We could see it right there. When I first saw the video after the Iran elections, and the young people took to the streets because of the flawed election, you recall that one young woman was shot down. And a friend was taking a video on the cell phone as she was shot down by the government. Within 4 hours, an entire generation around the world knew her name, her family, her Facebook, and was empathizing deeply. We are no longer privatized. We are extending the central nervous system to connect the human race. With the distributed energies, we extend our responsibility for the biosphere and the ecosystems. It's not going to give us utopia. It's not going to eliminate the fragilities and the inconsistencies and the imperfections and the struggle of being alive. But it will give us a sense of our stewardship of this planet. Last few thoughts. People say, well, how do we do this in time? I don't know if there's enough time. You know, I'm 65, I look back on this, and the only thing I know for sure is we didn't need the scientists to tell us about empathy. We know in the first few years of our life about attachment and empathy. We can feel it, pre-verbal. We can feel it. I'll give you an example. The Max Planck Institute did a little study with little 18-month-old kids, and a man had a clothesline, and if the clothes accidentally dropped on the floor, that's experiment one, or the second one, he would take the clothes off. The first one, he would drop them on the floor. The second one, he'd try to take them off, and they'd fall accidentally on the floor. Or in the first experiment, he had some books, and he would try to collect them, but they'd fall accidentally on the floor. The second one, he threw them on the floor. all the infants scampered to help him, only when they saw that he accidentally dropped them and was trying to get them together and they wanted to help him. None of the babies went if he intentionally dropped them on the floor. That's pre-verbal empathic distress for another being. And we know at the end of our life, when we look back, we don't look back on our life and we don't say, gee, that moment where I made a new deal, I felt really impregnable as an island to myself. I felt really detached and rational and really objective. I was able to extinguish my libido and enjoy my utility. I just don't think, there may be some pathological person that does that, but as my wife said, it's the deathbed test. When we look back at our life, we look back and it's the moments where we had that empathic connection, where we transcended ourselves and could actually feel a loved one or someone else as if we were experiencing ourselves. And we feel super alive. It's one of those moments where we actually feel transcendence. You don't have to be religious. And we felt we're connected to this mystery called life because we show solidarity with awe of it, and it makes us feel alive to be in solidarity with someone else's struggle to be. That would make a darn good civilization if all of us felt that way. So here's my last thought. Consciousness changes quickly when energy and communication revolutions happen. I'll give you an example. How many looked in the mirror today? Everyone gets guilty at this point for some reason. I mean, I know you're grooming yourself. So would you be surprised to know that this is kind of a new idea, seeing yourself? Up until the 1400s, people didn't get a good sense of themselves. They could look in a pond of water, whoa, there I am, or in a piece of metal. But in the 1400s in Murano off Venice, they started to mass produce small reflective mirrors that they give away with books, printed books. People started seeing themselves, and it became a pastime. Whoa, hey, look at that. Me. Before that, they didn't really see themselves. That's you. Now, why is that important? We call it self-reflection for a reason. Reflect. As we began to see ourselves, we could see all of our unique self, that we are an individual. I don't look like you. I could get a deeper sense by reflection of my own one and only life, and then by looking at you, I could see how different you are, but also how similar. That helped us deepen and broaden our empathic frame of reference. And for you baby boomers, we had the same experience. I'm a little older, but when the astronauts took their last Apollo mission across the dark side of the moon, and our boys came out on the bright side, and the sun was shining on the earth in all of its color, they snapped a few photos, and everyone here remembers, if they're a 60s generation, putting that huge poster on the wall showing the earth from outer space in all of its fragility, its beauty, its majesty. And that was an out-of-body experience. Everyone under 30 has this every day with Google Maps today. That shows you how the new energy communication changes consciousness. You can take a Google map and you can go down from the satellite, and if you're curious about someone you're Facebooking or Skyping with, you can go right to their house 20,000 miles away and look in the door. So we now can look at the world from the outside in, and now our central nervous systems allows us to embed ourselves in the biosphere itself, and if our energies are distributed across continents, we begin to get some shared sense of our responsibility for photosynthesis. So, last thing, you've been very patient. How many of you have taken your National Geographic DNA test? Nobody has taken their National Geographic DNA test? That's unusual. All right. You go up on the National Geographic website and you pay them $100. They send you a kit. My wife and I, my in-laws did this. We took DNA from our cheek, put it in the kit, sent it back to the lab. They analyzed our DNA, sent back the results, and gave us a map based on our DNA of where our family migrated from all the way back to the beginning of human history. It's wild. But they say something else when they sent us back the map that I apparently didn't know, but I'll share it with you so you can save $100. Apparently, 175,000 years ago in the Rift Valley of Africa, there were about 10,000 anatomically modern human beings walking the grasslands, our ancestors. The geneticists located one database woman. It's a database line. They call her the mitochondrial DNA Eve. Apparently, her genes passed to everyone in this room tonight. The other ladies didn't make it. Gets even more strange. They located a single male. This is a database line for genetics. They call him the Y chromosome Adam. Apparently a fairly potent guy. His genes passed to everyone in this room. The other men dead-ended. So here's the news. 6.8 billion people at various stages of consciousness, theological, ideological, psychological, dramaturgical, We're all fighting with each other with different ideas about the world, and well, guess what? We all came from two people. The Bible got this one right. We could have come from many, but the point is we have to begin thinking as an extended family. We have to broaden our sense of identity. We don't lose the old identities of nationhood and our religious identities and even our blood ties. But we extend our identity so we can think of the human race as our fellow sojourners and our other creatures here as part of our evolutionary family and the biosphere as our community. No better place than the British Royal Society for the Arts, because this is the place that started the discussion for the modern world. This is the place that began the discussion and the Great Enlightenment, which took us a leap forward in history in many ways, at the beginning of the market era and the nation-state era. Now, as we move to a biosphere and a global economy, the most important part of the agenda is a new cultural debate. We have to rethink the human narrative. If we are truly Homo empathicus, then we need to bring out that core nature. Because if it doesn't come out and it's repressed by our parenting, our educational system, our business practice and government, the secondary drives come. The narcissism, the materialism, the violence, the aggression. If we can have a global debate, let it start here from the British Royal Society for the Arts, which apparently you're doing, to begin rethinking human nature, to bring out our empathic sociability, so that we can rethink the institutions of society and prepare the groundwork for an empathic civilization. If we can do that, we may have enough time to reach biosphere consciousness before we face extinction. I think the jury is out. It'll be up to us, and especially the young people here, to make sure this discussion happens. Thank you.